Everyone talks about putting their garden to bed for winter, but what if sleep is actually the best time for radical transformation? Forget expensive fertilizers and endless tilling. This autumn, we're diving into a fascinating, often overlooked technique that turns ordinary waste into extraordinary soil. Here at the Living Soil Lab, I'm revealing how I've transformed a single garden bed into a worm paradise that's working overtime to create the richest, most biologically active soil you've ever seen. Autumn isn't just a time for cleanup and dormancy. It's actually the most strategic moment to supercharge your soil for the coming year. While most gardeners are pulling out spent plants and calling it a season, savvy soil builders recognize this as prime time to recruit millions of unpaid workers who will labor through fall and winter, transforming organic matter into pure gardening gold. These workers are earthworms, and when you deliberately cultivate them in a dedicated garden bed, you're essentially installing a living fertilizer factory that operates 24 hours a day. The magic of worm castings, the polite term for worm manure, cannot be overstated. These tiny pellets contain 5 times more nitrogen, 7 times more phosphorus, and 11 times more potassium than ordinary soil. Beyond these macronutrients, worm castings are loaded with beneficial microbes, enzymes, and plant growth hormones that synthetic fertilizers simply cannot replicate. When you create a worm feast bed in autumn, those worms spend the cooler months processing organic matter at a slower but steady pace, and by spring, you'll have transformed what was once kitchen scraps and garden waste into the most valuable soil amendment imaginable. The science behind vermiculture, worm farming, reveals why autumn is perfect for establishing your worm feast bed. Worms are most active in temperatures between 55 and 77 degrees Fahrenheit, which describes autumn weather in most temperate zones perfectly. As they consume organic matter, they're not just breaking it down mechanically, they're inoculating it with beneficial bacteria from their gut that helps unlock nutrients and suppress plant diseases. Each worm can process its own body weight in organic matter daily, and with thousands of worms working in concert, a properly managed worm bed can transform enormous quantities of material into finished compost in a fraction of the time traditional composting requires. Traditional composting relies on thermophilic bacteria that need hot temperatures to work efficiently, which means your compost pile often goes dormant in winter. Worm composting continues right through the cold months as long as temperatures stay above freezing, making it the perfect autumn-initiated project. The worms burrow deeper as surface temperatures drop, continuing their work in the warmer soil layers while your regular compost pile sits frozen and inactive. Creating a dedicated worm feast bed is simpler than most gardeners imagine and requires no expensive equipment. Select a garden bed that receives partial shade. Full sun locations get too hot for worms, while deeply shaded areas stay too cold and wet. Dig out the top 12 inches of soil and set it aside. The bottom of your bed becomes the worm zone, and you'll want to add a 6-inch base layer of partially decomposed organic matter like aged manure, finished compost, or well-rotted leaves. This base layer provides immediate food and creates the slightly acidic, moisture-retentive environment worms crave. Red wiggler worms are your species of choice for this project, not the common earthworms you find in garden soil. Red wigglers are composting specialists that reproduce rapidly, tolerate confined spaces, and process organic matter faster than any other worm species. You can order a pound of red wigglers online for about $30, and that single pound contains roughly 1,000 worms, more than enough to establish a thriving colony. Introduce your worms to the prepared bed by gently placing them on the surface at dusk when temperatures are cool. They'll immediately burrow down to escape light, and within hours they'll be settled into their new home. Feeding your worm bed requires understanding what worms love and, honestly, what they'll avoid. Worms devour fruit and vegetable scraps, coffee grounds with filters, crushed eggshells, shredded cardboard, and even fallen leaves. They process these materials best when they're chopped into smaller pieces. Think of it as, pre-digesting their food. Bury food scraps under a few inches of bedding material to help prevent odors and fruit fly infestations. What you absolutely must avoid is meat, dairy, oils, and pet waste, since all of these create anaerobic conditions that kill worms and produce some pretty nauseating smells. Feed lightly at first, maybe a gallon of scraps per week for a 4 by 8 foot bed, and increase as the worm population grows. Within 6 to 8 weeks of establishing your worm bed, you'll notice dark, crumbly material accumulating. These are worm castings, and they represent the pinnacle of organic fertilizer. Harvesting castings from an active worm bed requires strategy, since you don't want to remove the worms themselves. The simplest method is side harvesting, where you push all bedding and material to one side of the bed, add fresh bedding and food to the empty side, and wait about 2 weeks. The worms will migrate to the fresh food, allowing you to harvest the finished castings from the abandoned side. This method is gentle, doesn't stress the worm colony, and can be repeated continuously. Worm tea, the liquid that drains from worm beds, is equally valuable, though often overlooked. If you've created a slightly raised bed or added drainage, you can collect this amber liquid runoff, which is concentrated with water-soluble nutrients and beneficial microbes. Dilute worm tea at a ratio of 10 parts water to 1 part tea, and use it as a foliar spray or soil drench on your perennial plants, fall crops, or even your lawn. The microbial boost is particularly valuable in autumn when you're trying to strengthen plants before winter dormancy. Some gardeners consider worm tea even more valuable than the castings themselves because it delivers nutrition and beneficial biology in a form plants can access immediately. As autumn progresses toward winter, your worm bed needs protection to keep your colony alive and working. Once nighttime temperatures consistently drop below 40 degrees, add a thick insulating layer of straw, shredded leaves, or cardboard over the entire bed. Aim for at least 6 inches of coverage. This insulation moderates temperature swings and prevents the bed from freezing solid. The worms will naturally move to the warmest zone in the bed, typically the center and bottom areas where decomposition generates modest heat. Reduce feeding frequency in winter to match the worm's slower metabolism. Every 2 to 3 weeks is sufficient. So, the real payoff comes in spring when you incorporate your winter's worth of worm castings into planting beds just before seeding or transplanting. Those castings will inoculate your entire garden with beneficial microbes, provide slow-release nutrition that feeds plants for months, and honestly, improve soil structure so dramatically that you'll see differences in water retention and root development within the first season. The worm colony you establish this autumn becomes a permanent asset that multiplies each year, eventually spreading throughout your garden as worms migrate from the feast bed into surrounding areas. Your journey to living soil starts with understanding that the most powerful gardening tools aren't purchased, they're cultivated. By creating your own worm feast bed this autumn, you're investing in a biological system that will compound returns for years to come. Subscribe to the Living Soil Lab for detailed updates on managing your worm colony through winter and spring techniques for using castings to maximize plant health. Share this guide with fellow gardeners ready to transform waste into their most valuable garden input. Your soil revolution begins with a single bed and 1,000 tiny workers. Let's get started.